Okay, good morning, everybody. Thanks to everyone in the Sharjah Foundation. I'm Daniel Blanga Gubbay. I'm currently based in Brussels, where I work for a performing art festival, which is called Kunstenfestival des Arts. And today I would like to give a very short presentation about a specific topic, which is the topic of fiction and the use of fiction as a political tool. And 1 year ago, I was asked by Mada Masr, a journal in Cairo, to review an exhibition organized by Mofradat, which is a Brussels-based organization dealing with supporting artists coming from the Arab world. To review this exhibition organized at the occasion of Meeting Point 8 and happening in 3 different episodes in Cairo, Brussels, and Beirut. And the Brussels episode is at the core of that short presentation that I will do today, in which, starting from the topic of March meeting, I would like to sketch the potentiality of fiction as a political tool, or we can say, paraphrasing the title, fiction as an active form. So in the written presentation of the exhibition, curators Malak Helmi and Raimundas Malasauskas, they wrote, could we think of an exhibition as the home of an album that you enter when you open the door and climb the stair? So entering an album or a music album means to deliberately abandon oneself to the experience of a non-homogeneous time. So an instant of silence precedes the tracks, and then as the music starts, we are hypnotically transported into the music and in another time by the track. So we transcend the present and enter the music before being brought to the surface as the music stops, as a deep breath after the apnea. So the silence between one track and the other acts like a theater curtain, veiling and unveiling the music and rhythming the show. So I'm using this image of the curtain since the exhibition of Meeting Point was titled Both Sides of the Curtain. And I would like to focus on this image, also like this image that I'm using here that comes from Ulla van Brandenburg. Indeed, the curtain does not simply divide the hall and the stage, but it delimitates the space of fiction. And for this reason, the curtain was a crucial threshold in Michel Foucault's text on other spaces, Heterotopia, written in Tunis in 1967. And he was defining Heterotopia as a space determined by being other than reality. So while opening and closing the curtain, or the curtain does not simply rhythm the show, but it rhythms fiction within reality, setting a space within which a different set of rules exist, so a space of fiction. So if we look again at the title of the exhibition, Both Sides of a Curtain, it is clear that it's not simply about the curtain and fiction, but the title contains its inevitable heritage of political weight. So this idea of the other side of the curtain, echoing the iron one made in the geopolitical lexicon of the Cold War. And in the exhibition that was presenting mainly artists coming from the Arab world, the curtain stands at something which is not, that does not invite to be crossed, but a threshold beyond which the other stands, and the exhibition plays with the evolution of the idea of a political other in the West. So, and the perception of the Arab world and its representation. I'm insisting on this idea of a kind of political representation because indeed, beyond the line of the curtain, there is not simply the other in a political perspective, rather its representation. We can say that in the sound of a curtain opening, we might hear the echo of the idea of exoticism, or the echo of Edward Said saying that reality cannot be deprived of the other echoes inhabit the garden. So this might be the premise of the exhibition, that fiction has been extensively used as a tool in fixing the identity, for example, in the exotic representation of the other that is constructed through fiction. Yet, the particularity of the exhibition and the reason why I took it as a starting point stands in countering this peculiar way. And the desire of the show is not simply to show the existence of fiction and nor to simply deconstruct fiction, but rather to understand how to reappropriate fiction from the inside and to acknowledge the use of fiction as a tool or a counter tool of self-affirmation, and in this sense as an instrument of revolt. So in the opening weekend of the exhibition, artist Lawrence Abu Hamdan gave a lecture about a lecture performance titled Contradiction, Speech Against Itself. And within this lecture performance, he disclosed a reflection on taqiyya, so the dispensation from performing the truth, allowing Muslims to lie in order to protect themselves or to protect the community. So Lawrence Abu Hamdan uses taqiyya to speak about fiction as a weapon. So the topic of taqiyya has been very present in the last 10 years. Also, Reza Negarestani, the Iranian philosopher, used in a text titled The Militarization of Peace, speaking about a shift we might see from the idea of a camouflage to the idea of a hyper-camouflage. So if the idea of camouflage would be to try to hide in order to protect oneself, the idea of a hyper-camouflage would be to create a fictional self, not simply in order to defend oneself, but in order to attack the other. And in the lecture of Lawrence Abu Hamdan, he goes away from this militarized use of taqiyya, but to explore the potentiality of fiction as an act of freedom. So we can say a freedom to lie, or a freedom of artificiality, or a freedom from identity. In order to better clarify this idea of a fiction as a freedom from identity, I would like to go for a moment out from of the exhibition to quote a recent manifesto that I think might give a clear idea of what does it mean, this freedom through fiction, and a recent manifesto that proposed fiction as a political tool. So 3 years ago, the feminist collective Laboria Cubonics released a manifesto which is titled Xenofeminist, A Politics for Alienation, constructed as a critique to the transformation, of the modern transformation of nature into nature with capital N, and its glorification and its use as a fixed image that is very often used in conservative politics. And the first page of the manifesto, which is constructed in a opposition between nature and fiction, the first page of the manifesto says, and I'm quoting, "Anyone who's been deemed unnatural in the face of running biological norms, anyone who's experienced injustice wrought in the name of natural order, will realize that the glorification of nature has nothing to offer us, the queer and trans among us, the differently abled, as well as those who have suffered discrimination. Xenofeminism seizes, on the contrary, alienation as an impetus to generate new words. We are all alienated, but have we ever been otherwise? It is true, and not despite our alienated condition, that we can free ourselves from the muck of immediacy." So this is the end of the quote. So coming from the tradition of sci-fi feminism, Laboria Cubonics sees fiction as an alienating tool, so to create even more fictional categories and fictional identities. Which means a form of liberation from assigned and fixed identities. So xenofeminism quotes in different interviews how they followed something that has been explored extensively in the last years through Afro and Arab futurism. So using fictional element as a way to re-narrate identities, and often mixing science fictional element to perturb and hence denounce the iconography of primitivism that is projected by the colonial gaze. So the idea that we need more fiction, and this, in the words of Abu Hamdan, is explicitly proposed, if we go back to the exhibition, as a shift to be subserving to a narrative, to the idea of being subverting. So it is the idea of dressing oneself with fiction as a subversive tool to work with fiction in order to destroy and assign fiction. So in this direction, in the exhibition, in a narrow corridor at the first floor at La Loge, where the exhibition took place, lays a video of Qatari-American artist Sofia Almaria. So as one of the pioneers of the use of Arab and Gulf futurism, and since her work in 2008, she was writing a blog, The Gaze of Sci-Fi Wahhabism. Sofia Almaria often spoke of fiction as a tool to move the boundaries of assigned identity. So for example, in a text on her blog, which is titled A Fictional Account of the Arabian Gulf's Exodus from Reality, she was speaking about herself in the third person and in the idea of producing new fictions. And she wrote, I have named her in order to redepart from my person. I have also masked her in science fiction in order to create a pure screen of identity and in order to re-arrive at the place of critical entanglement, unrecognized and uninhibited. The third person is a useful tool. So and here we can see one video that Sofia Almaria updated online. They are all videos coming from YouTube, which is called Eli Rabani and the Eye of the Tigers. But in the installation at La Loge of Sofia Almaria, images are layering one on top of the other in a kind of complex montage that creates a narrative beyond linearity and that forms as an imaginary that refuses to be domesticated. So while looking at, I would just like maybe to, so while looking at her and at her videos, something appear in the ways of the montage as well, and of the editing. It is clear that fiction is not used to contrast one narrative by writing a different one, but fiction explodes as an element that layers, as elements and layers on top of the other that contrast the reading of a single narrative. Yesterday, here, in the images of Mancia Diawara, there was the image of Glisson speaking about opacity, and he was evoking the idea of an oversimplification of complexity as a feature of Western politics. So he was saying that a desire to conquer the unknown coexist in Western modernity with the impossibility of dealing with the unknown as such. So opening to an attempt to reduce complexity into an image to grasp. So the idea of understanding is grasping something. And I would like to add that this violence, or the violence of this reduction of the other, is for sure not weaker today, or let's say very strong in the middle of a new waves of right-wing populism that go on by reducing and presenting simplified version of the present. Against this background, fiction appears as a necessary tool not to construct a different narrative, but rather as an active ingredient to blur, or that contributes in reclaiming a complexity and the right to opacity beyond the understanding of the other. So in the exhibition at La Loge, the screen of Sofia Almaria lays on the sand as ironically alluding to the exotic stereotype of an oasis in the middle of the desert, reclaiming here as a source of self-complexity springing in the middle of the reduction. So with Sofia Maria, we speak of a mix of fictionalized self, and the fictions enter the present without fitting it, like a firework exploding on an evening in the middle of the week and out of any celebration. The explosion does not fit in a given calendar, and nevertheless, precisely because it does not fit the image of the present, maybe it adds something to it. Perhaps its anachronistic appearance will suggest the possibility of the plurality of history beyond the celebrated ones, and a more complex image of the present. So fiction does not attempt, in this case, to rewrite the present, but rather it invades the present without fitting into it. It is incompatible and yet there, forcing to accept the complexity beyond understanding. So it is an active form, and its explosion purrs the homogeneity of the present and reopens it as a broken bone that is inserted in the skin of the present, obliging to reconfigure the body. So I would like to go back at the beginning of the text and the model of heterotopia, because in the last passage of the text, Foucault was writing that the heterotopia is capable of juxtaposing in a single place several spaces, so several sites that are in themselves incompatible. Thus, it is that the theater brings onto the rectangle of a stage, one after the other, a whole series of plays that are foreign to one another. So to conclude, maybe the curtain is not dividing this incompatibility, but maybe it is the space of this incompatibility. Maybe it's not dividing rhythm, but it is a rhythm, like a rhythm that enters another rhythm in a polyrhythmic song where different beats are incompatible and yet they're present to construct the complexity of a track. And I would just like to hear 1 minute of this polyrhythmic song, and I choose one song of The Knife. So fiction is not something to discover, or as the exhibition opens it, fiction is not something to discover, but a cover under which to move in a political agenda that does not construct an alternative, but rather reclaims the possibility of a complex self that cannot be domesticated into a single narrative. So it is like adding a hidden rhythm and dance under it, entering the space of the future. So maybe this is the final exercise that the exhibition asks and that the show proposes, the one of dancing under the cover of a fictional rhythm. Thank you.